Google didn't dominate the internet because it had the best algorithm. It dominated because people trusted the answer. That trust did not erode slowly. It was spent, not in a scandal, not in a collapse, not through competition. It was traded deliberately to protect revenue. Before that trade, Google occupied a position no company had ever held. It was not a product people compared. It was not a service people evaluated. It was the final step in decision-making. People did not use Google to explore possibilities. They used it to end uncertainty. The top result was not treated as a suggestion. It was treated as resolution. This is why Google search functioned as authority, not software. Authority is what makes answers feel finished. That authority compounded automatically. Every correct result strengthened belief. Every belief reduced scrutiny. Every reduction in scrutiny increased dependence. Dependence is leverage. Google controlled the most trusted action on the internet. Not scrolling, not sharing, searching. Search is intent. Intent is where decisions happen. Whoever controls intent does not compete for attention. They allocate it. That was Google's position. And it worked until Google made a single structural decision that permanently broke the relationship. Not because the product failed, because trust was no longer protected from monetization. Search did not collapse. It hollowed out. The product still worked. The answers still appeared. But credibility stopped compounding. And once credibility stops compounding, authority never returns. This is the story of that decision. To understand why that decision mattered, you have to understand what Google actually was before it made it. The early internet was wide, loud, and unfiltered. Information existed everywhere, but credibility did not. Google's product was not discovery, it was triage. It took a chaotic web and produced an ordered output, a ranked list that implied priority. That ranking. Order mattered more than the content itself. The web had always contained good information. The problem was selection. Selection is where trust forms. Selection is where trust is spent. Google turned selection into a machine that felt neutral. Neutrality is an accelerant for trust. Trust expands faster when it looks automatic. Google's results did not feel like persuasion. They felt like sorting. Sorting feels objective even when it is not. Sorting lowers resistance. Users did not approach the first result as a suggestion. They approached it as a recommendation. Over time, the first result became the answer. The link became secondary. The decision had already been made by the order. This is how search became authority instead of a tool. It was not because every result was correct. It was because the system felt consistent. Consistency is what trains behavior. Behavior is what creates leverage. Once people trusted the ranking, they stopped evaluating the mechanism. They evaluated themselves. If the result was wrong, the assumption was not, Google is unreliable. The assumption was, I searched incorrectly. That assumption was structural protection. It redirected doubt away from the system. A system that redirects doubt compounds trust. It compounds even through errors. This is why Google did not need perfect accuracy to dominate. It needed predictable usefulness. Predictable usefulness creates dependency. Dependency creates leverage. Leverage is not traffic volume. Leverage is what traffic allows you to do. Google controlled the entrance to the web. It controlled the first step of almost every intent. That meant Google did not just capture attention, it allocated it. Allocation is power when everyone else depends on it. Publishers depended on it. Businesses depended on it. Creators depended on it. A restaurant could exist without a website. It could not exist without being found. A product could be better than competitors. It could still fail if it could not be discovered. Discovery was not a marketing problem. It was a ranking problem. Ranking was controlled by one system. That system was Google. This dependence created a quiet hierarchy. Google at the top, the rest of the web beneath it. The web did not negotiate with Google. It adapted to Google. Design changed to please Google. Writing changed to please Google. Business models changed to please Google. This was not coercion. It was gravity. When a platform becomes the default path to attention, it does not need enforcement. It just needs to remain believed. Belief is what made Google different from other platforms. Social platforms distributed attention through social proof. Search distributed attention through perceived objectivity. Objectivity scales better than popularity. Popularity shifts with taste. Objectivity feels stable. Google's authority did not come from personality. It came from procedure. Procedure builds trust because it looks repeatable. Repeatability reduces anxiety. People used Google to settle arguments, to confirm purchases, to decide where to go, to choose what to believe next. Search became the arbiter for everyday decisions, not because it was always right, because it was accepted as the best available filter. When the filter is trusted, the entire system becomes efficient. Users spend less time evaluating, they spend less time comparing, they spend less time doubting. That efficiency is addictive. It changes expectation. Once the expectation is set, alternatives feel slow, not slower in speed, slower in certainty. This is why Google's position held for so long. It owned the highest trust action on the internet. Scrolling through social feeds is discretionary. Searching is instrumental. Instrumental behavior is harder to displace. It is not entertainment, it is function. Google became part of how people executed intent. Intent is the most valuable resource online. Entertainment can be replaced. Intent is harder to reroute. This is where Google's leverage became economic. Google did not need to create products people loved. It needed to remain the default answer engine. That default status turned trust into revenue, not directly, structurally. Advertisers followed intent because intent converts. Publishers followed intent because intent brings traffic. Every market followed intent because intent is where decisions happen. Google controlled the highest concentration of intent on the internet. That made it more than a company. It made it an intermediary for reality. Intermediaries earn rent. They earn it because they reduce friction and command dependency. Google reduced friction by making the web navigable. Then it made itself the navigation layer. When a navigation layer is trusted, it becomes invisible. It stops being evaluated as a product. People did not describe using Google. They described knowing. They did not say, "I found this through Google." They said, "I looked it up." The mechanism disappeared from language. That is what complete trust looks like. At that point, Google's competitive advantage was no longer technical. It was psychological. The algorithm could improve. The interface could change. Those were refinements. The core advantage was that Google was believed. Belief is what made the top result feel safe. Safety is what made Google scalable. A trusted filter can serve billions without personal relationship. This is what allowed Google to build leverage across the entire web. It could redirect traffic at will. It could reorder winners and losers without direct confrontation. It did not need to threaten. It did not need to negotiate. It just needed to rank. When ranking is trusted, ranking becomes governance. Governance is leverage. That leverage did not come from engagement. It came from reliance. Facebook built leverage by keeping you inside. Google built leverage by sending you out. Sending you out made it feel less controlling. It made it feel more neutral. That neutrality expanded trust even further. As long as the system's output felt aligned with the user's intent, authority compounded. Each successful search reinforced the next. This is why trust created a flywheel. Trust led to reliance. Reliance led to habit. Habit led to default status. Default status led to leverage. Once leverage existed, the entire web treated Google as a governing layer, not officially, functionally. That is the position Google held before anything changed, a position built on one fragile asset: credibility. Google's real power was trust, not traffic. Google did not wake up one day and decide to weaken search. The decision was not framed internally as compromise. It was framed as optimization. By the mid-2010s, Google search had reached a point where growth was no longer the problem it was built to solve. Search volume was massive. Usage was habitual. Default status was entrenched. What changed was pressure, not competitive pressure, not technical pressure, economic pressure. Google's core business had matured. User growth slowed. Query growth flattened. The marginal value of each additional search declined. At the same time, expectations increased. Shareholders expected revenue expansion. Markets expected efficiency. The system was expected to extract more value from the same behavior. This is where incentives shifted. Search had always been monetized, but monetization had been restrained. Ads were visible but separate, labeled clearly, positioned carefully, distinct from answers. That distinction mattered more than it appeared to. It preserved the psychological contract. Users understood that ads existed, but they trusted that answers were protected. Protection is what allowed trust to compound. As long as users believed ranking integrity was insulated from revenue incentives, credibility held. And credibility was the real engine. But credibility does not appear on financial statements. Revenue density does. As growth plateaued, the pressure was not to create new behavior. It was to extract more value from existing behavior. Search already captured intent. Intent is the most valuable input in advertising. The only inefficiency left was under monetization. From a systems perspective, the conclusion was obvious. If users already trust the answer and advertisers already want to be near intent, then the distance between ads and answers is wasted surface area. Reducing that distance increases yield. This is the logic that drove the shift. Not greed, not carelessness. Optimization. Sponsored results moved higher. Formatting became more native. Labels became smaller. Visual distinction softened. Each individual change was defensible. Each improved metrics. Each increased click-through. Each raised revenue per query, and none of them broke search outright. That was the danger. The changes did not feel like corruption, they felt like refinement. Internally, this was framed as relevance, as better matching, as improved user experience. Ads were no longer just promotions, they were helpful results. They answered queries. They solved problems. They looked like content. This framing mattered because it allowed the system to believe nothing fundamental was changing, but something fundamental was changing. The boundary between answer and incentive was dissolving, not removed, blurred. And blur is far more dangerous than replacement. If ads had simply overwhelmed search, users would have reacted. If answers had obviously degraded, trust would have snapped. But neither happened. Instead, the system became ambiguous. Ambiguity does not trigger outrage. It triggers hesitation. Users did not abandon Google. They adjusted behavior. That adjustment did not show up immediately because metrics lag psychology. From Google's perspective, the shift worked. Revenue increased, engagement remained. Search volume held. Nothing broke, which reinforced the belief that the trade-off was safe. This is how irreversible decisions happen, not through dramatic failures, through successful optimizations. Each iteration normalized the next. Once ads were integrated more tightly, further integration felt incremental. Once labels shrank, clarity felt optional. Once ranking included revenue signals, excluding them felt inefficient. The system adjusted around the new logic. Importantly, this was not about deceiving users. It was about aligning incentives. Google did not decide to trick people. It decided to let monetization participate in ranking logic. That is a crucial distinction. Participation is not domination, but it changes outcomes. Once revenue participates in ranking, ranking is no longer purely epistemic. It becomes economic. The system no longer asks only, what is most useful? It also asks, what is most valuable? Those questions can overlap, but they are not identical. Google believed overlap was sufficient, that usefulness would protect trust, that quality would mask incentives. This belief was reasonable because it had worked before, but this time, the scale was different. Search was no longer a growing product. It was a mature infrastructure. Infrastructure is judged differently. Small distortions propagate widely. Minor bias compounds across billions of interactions. At that scale, perception matters more than intent. And perception began to shift, not because ads existed, they always had, but because ads stopped feeling separate. Users did not consciously say, Google is lying. They felt something softer, uncertainty. The top result stopped feeling definitive. The order stopped feeling final. Scrolling increased. Scrolling is a signal. When users trust answers, they click quickly. When they don't, they hedge. Hedging behavior is subtle. It looks like engagement. It feels like exploration. But it is distrust in motion. Google did not see collapse. It saw stability, which made the decision feel validated. Internally, this mattered, because once a system commits to revenue density, reversing feels irresponsible. Pulling ads back would reduce yield. Clarifying labels would reduce clicks. Restoring separation would create friction. Friction is treated as inefficiency, and inefficiency is punished in mature systems. This is why the shift was not temporary. It was structural. Search became optimized for monetization within trust, rather than trust insulated from monetization. That inversion is the core decision. Google did not abandon trust, it spent it. Trust functioned as a buffer, a reserve that allowed higher extraction. From a financial standpoint, this was correct. From a system standpoint, it was terminal, because trust only compounds when it is protected from incentives. Once incentives are visible inside answers, credibility stops growing. It does not vanish, it flattens. Flat credibility feels fine, until comparison emerges. At the time, Google did not fear comparison. No alternative matched its scale. No competitor offered equivalent coverage, which made the decision feel safe. But dominance hides fragility. When trust is the asset, any dilution is permanent. Google chose to prioritize revenue density over perceptual clarity. Not recklessly, not maliciously, deliberately. The product still worked. The answer still appeared. Users still searched, but the relationship changed. Search was no longer a place to end uncertainty. It became a place to manage it. That shift was not visible in revenue. It was visible in behavior. More scrolling, more refinement, more skepticism. And skepticism does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Google accepted this trade because the alternative was stagnation. And stagnation is unacceptable to systems designed for growth. The choice was between slower monetization with protected trust or higher monetization with managed risk. Google chose managed risk. That choice stabilized the business. It destabilized authority, and once authority is compromised by incentives, it cannot be restored through optimization, only through restraint. Restraint was no longer compatible with the system Google had become. This is why the decision felt inevitable, not because Google wanted to weaken search, but because it wanted to protect revenue without rethinking the model that depended on trust. The monetization shift did not kill search, it rewired it. And rewired systems do not revert. They continue operating. They just stop compounding the thing that made them dominant. The consequences of the monetization shift did not arrive as a reaction. They arrived as an adjustment. Users did not abandon Google. They did not revolt. They did not articulate a clear complaint. They adapted. This is how trust collapses in systems that still function. Nothing breaks. Behavior changes. Before the shift, search behavior was decisive. Queries ended quickly. Clicks were confident. The first result carried weight. After, the shift behavior softened. Users paused. They scrolled. They compared. This was not exploration. It was hesitation. Hesitation is the earliest signal of lost authority. When people trust an answer, they stop evaluating. When they stop trusting it, they begin hedging. Google did not lose usage. It lost finality. Search results stopped feeling conclusive. They felt provisional. The top result became a starting point rather than the answer. Scrolling replaced clicking. Tab hoarding replaced resolution. These behaviors look harmless in analytics. Time on page increases. Engagement looks healthy. But psychologically, the relationship inverted. Search no longer ended uncertainty. It extended it. That change did not require users to consciously distrust Google. It only required them to sense ambiguity. Ambiguity is corrosive to authority. Authority depends on closure. Closure depends on clarity. Clarity depends on perceived independence. Once ads and answers became visually and structurally intertwined, independence became harder to assume, not because ads were bad, because incentives were now visible inside the answer space. Users began to sense that ranking was no longer purely epistemic. They did not articulate this, they compensated for it. Compensation is the key word. People added qualifiers to queries. They searched multiple times. They cross-checked sources. Most notably, they appended terms like Reddit, forum, or review to queries. This behavior is often misinterpreted as platform migration. It is not. It is trust redistribution. Users were not leaving Google. They were bypassing its authority layer. They used Google as a routing tool, not a decision engine. That distinction matters. When people trust search, they accept its judgment. When they don't, they use it to find other judgments. Google still facilitated discovery. It stopped being believed. Belief is what creates leverage. Without belief, Google could still show results. It could not command confidence. This erosion happened unevenly, and uneven erosion is hard to detect. Some queries still felt authoritative. Navigational searches worked fine. Factual lookups still resolved quickly. But commercial queries changed first. Anything involving money, health, or high stakes triggered skepticism. These were the areas where ads were densest, where monetization pressure was highest. Users did not assume malice. They assumed bias. Bias does not require intent. It only requires incentive. Once users perceive incentive alignment inside answers, they treat output differently. They no longer defer. They evaluate. Evaluation is expensive. It slows decisions. It reduces efficiency. Efficiency was Google's advantage. As efficiency declined, users adapted by fragmenting trust. They trusted Google for directions. They trusted Reddit for opinions. They trusted YouTube for demonstrations. They trusted Amazon for purchase validation. Google became a switchboard, not a judge. This shift was subtle, but it was decisive. Before, Google organized the web. After, it indexed it. Indexing is not authority. It is utility. Utilities persist. Authorities command. Google retained scale. It lost command. From the outside, this did not look like decline. Revenue grew. Usage remained massive. But leverage depends on behavior, not volume. Leverage exists when others must orient around you. When businesses design around you, when creators depend on you. That dependence weakened. Publishers adjusted first. SEO strategies became defensive. Rather than building for compounding reach, publishers optimized for volatility. They assumed rankings would fluctuate. They diversified traffic sources. They stopped treating Google as a stable base. This was not rebellion. It was risk management. Creators followed. Search-driven growth became unreliable. Algorithms felt opaque. Past performance stopped predicting future visibility. Creators stopped building identities that depended on search traffic. They built portable audiences, email lists, social followings, communities. Optionality increased. Optionality dissolves leverage. Advertisers adjusted too. Search ads still converted, but confidence changed. Brands tested alternatives. They layered platforms. They accepted higher acquisition costs in exchange for diversification. Google was still essential. It was no longer exclusive. Exclusivity is leverage. Participation is not. None of this triggered alarms internally because the system still performed. This is the danger of behavioral erosion. It does not announce itself in metrics. It reveals itself in posture. Google's posture changed from authority to service. Services compete. Authorities govern. Once users stop treating the top result as final, ranking loses power. Ranking without belief is just ordering. Ordering does not command behavior, it accommodates it. This is why trust collapsed without users leaving. The system still answered questions. It just stopped ending conversations. That is the core shift, and it is irreversible. Trust does not degrade linearly. It plateaus, then it fragments. Google's trust did not disappear. It scattered. Different domains carried different levels of confidence. The brand stopped functioning as a universal filter. Universality was the leverage. Once users felt the need to verify, Google stopped being the arbiter. It became the starting point. Starting points are replaceable. Arbiters are not. Importantly, Google could not see this clearly from inside because internal success metrics rewarded engagement, not resolution. More scrolling looked positive. Longer sessions looked healthy. Multiple queries looked like activity. But activity is not authority. Authority reduces activity. It shortens sessions. It ends loops. Google had built a system that minimized friction. Now it had introduced ambiguity. Ambiguity increases friction, but in a way that looks like exploration. The system misread the signal. By the time alternative behaviors normalized, trust had already flattened. This is why new entrants did not need to beat Google. They only needed to absorb the trust Google stopped compounding. Reddit did not replace Google. It captured the trust Google relinquished in opinion-heavy queries. YouTube did not replace search. It captured trust in demonstrative queries. Amazon did not replace Google. It captured trust in transactional decisions. Each platform absorbed a slice of authority. Fragmented authority cannot dominate. Google became one of several trusted tools, not the trusted tool. This fragmentation did not reduce Google's relevance. It reduced its leverage. Leverage is concentration. Trust fragmentation destroys concentration. Once that happens, no optimization restores it. Google could add features, improve results, deploy AI summaries. None of that repairs the underlying relationship, because the issue is not output quality. It is incentive alignment. As long as ads are structurally embedded inside answers, users will hedge. They may not complain. They may not leave, but they will not defer. And deferral is the mechanism of authority. This is how trust collapses without a visible crisis. The system remains large, it remains useful, it remains profitable, but it stops being believed at scale. Belief is what allowed Google to dictate terms to the web. Once belief fragments, the web reorganizes around optionality. That reorganization is quiet, it is rational, it is permanent. Search did not collapse, it hollowed out. The product still works, the interface still loads, the answers still appear. What disappeared was the assumption that Google's answer was the answer. And once that assumption is gone, authority does not return. It does not matter how accurate results are. It does not matter how advanced the algorithm becomes. Trust does not respond to upgrades. It responds to insulation from incentives. That insulation was removed. The behavior adapted. The relationship changed, and Google's dominance dissolved without spectacle, not through loss of users, through loss of belief. The final cost of Google's decision is not visible in usage charts. It is visible in posture. Once trust is broken inside a system that still works, it cannot be selectively repaired. That is the part Google cannot undo. Trust is not a feature. It is a relationship formed through insulation. Google's authority existed because users believed search results were protected from incentives. Not perfectly, but structurally. Once monetization crossed into the answer layer, that insulation ended. Not because ads existed, because they became indistinguishable from resolution. At that point, Google's incentives stopped being abstract. They became legible. Legibility is fatal to authority. Authority relies on asymmetry. One side knows less. One side decides more. When users begin to perceive incentives inside the decision layer, asymmetry collapses. The system becomes negotiable. Negotiable systems cannot command belief. This is why trust cannot be restored through interface changes, or labeling, or disclosure. Once users learn that answers are optimized for revenue density, every future answer is evaluated through that lens. Evaluation replaces deference. Deference is leverage. Google can improve accuracy. It can improve relevance. It can deploy better models. None of that rebuilds authority, because authority is not about correctness. It is about finality. Finality disappeared the moment users felt the need to verify. This is why the damage is permanent. Trust does not reset when incentives are clarified. It only compounds when incentives are hidden or aligned. Google chose alignment with revenue over insulation from it. That trade stabilized the business. It ended dominance. Search survived. It still functions. It still captures enormous volume. But it no longer defines truth pathways the way it once did. It routes users. It does not settle questions. That distinction explains everything that followed. Google did not lose relevance. It lost centrality. Centrality is what allows platforms to dictate terms, to shape ecosystems, to govern behavior indirectly. Without centrality, platforms compete. They respond. They explain. Google now explains itself constantly, through UI changes, through disclaimers, through transparency reports. Explanation is the signal. Systems with authority do not explain. They are assumed. Once explanation becomes necessary, belief has already thinned. This is why Google's response strategies cannot recover what was lost. Adding AI summaries does not restore trust. It concentrates skepticism. More surface area means more incentive exposure, more reasons to hedge. Even if answers improve, users will still cross-check, still scroll, still defer belief, because once the relationship changes, it does not revert. Search is no longer a verdict. It is a draft. Drafts invite revision. Verdicts end discussion. Google moved from verdict to draft the moment it optimized the answer layer for monetization. That move was rational. Growth had plateaued. Revenue density mattered. Shareholder expectations hardened. Google did not choose between good and evil. It chose between leverage and predictability. Predictability won. Predictable systems are easier to manage, easier to regulate, easier to defend. Dominant systems attract scrutiny. Scrutiny introduces risk. Google eliminated that risk by flattening authority. Flattened authority is survivable. It is not commanding. This is why Google did not fail. Failure implies malfunction. Search still works. This was a completed trade. Google exchanged compounding credibility for monetization stability. The exchange cannot be reversed without reintroducing the very risk it removed. To restore authority, Google would need to rebuild insulation. To rebuild insulation, it would need to reduce ad density. To reduce ad density, it would need to accept revenue volatility. Volatility is what the system was optimized to eliminate. So the decision stands. The web adjusted. Users adapted. Trust fragmented. Search did not die. It stopped being believed. That is the cost Google cannot undo. Not because competitors won, not because technology changed, not because users revolted, but because credibility, once spent, does not regenerate through optimization. It regenerates only through restraint. Google chose optimization. And when optimization touched the answer layer, authority ended. Google didn't lose search. Search stopped believing Google.